Hello, my friends. Good to see you all. Now, having taught the Holocaust for over 20 years now, remarkably, there are a number of questions that keep recurring. And one of these is why German Jews, after experiencing the harsh realities of Nazi rule once Hitler comes to power in 1933, don't just leave the country. The first thing to say, of course, is that many Jews do decide to leave. Overall, what you have is rates of emigration tend to rise in reaction to fresh waves of persecution. So you have an initial exodus in 1933, and then things slow down again in 1934, only to rise very sharply again the following year. And the reason they do that, of course, is in 1935 we get the introduction of the Nuremberg laws, which effectively strip all German Jews of citizenship. And many people now recognise in 1935 that there is no future for them. But it's an interesting picture because others actually welcome the 1935 laws. Because at least for them it resolves the status of the Jews and allows them to remain in Germany, albeit as non-persons. So there's been this pogrom at the start, this flurry of anti-Semitic legislation now, and they believe now this is the culmination of it in 1935. It's not much of a life, but at least, as it were, we know where we stand. The hope is you're going to reduce the kind of random acts of violence and humiliation that these poor German Jews have been experiencing on an almost daily basis. And in fact, it's true that many Jews actually do come back. Those who'd left between 1933 and 35 come back to Germany after the Nuremberg laws. It's really Kristallnacht. When you get the devastation of Kristallnacht, November 1938, the Jews realised that life is no longer safe for them in Nazi Germany. And that's when you tend to get a large outflow of German Jews. So emigration soars after Kristallnacht in all Nazi-occupied territories. And in the weeks after Kristallnacht, we have to remember, the Nazis unleashed a whole new wave of new anti-Semitic legislation. So you have closing of Jewish schools, forbidding the practices of the rest of the Jewish professionals. Many had already been targeted earlier on, as well as the forced alienation of Jewish businesses. But the question, I suppose, still remains, why not leave? Well, the first thing I think you have to say is that leaving your homeland itself is never easy. While Jews themselves constitute only about 1% of the population, there's approximately 550,000 people, Jewish people, in Germany at the time. They are fully assimilated into German life. They, of course, themselves are descendants of Jews who'd settled there during the past 2,000 years. Long before, ironically, the nation of Germany itself was even conceived. And this is a story which happens with many Jewish communities. They've been there for thousands of years. It's only later, in the 19th century, that the nations, as it were, that enclosed them are actually formed. The borders, as it were, form around them, with all the often nastiness that this kind of partial nationalism involves. So they'd flourished in these places for generations. And of course, embedded in German life, they'd fought in previous wars on behalf of Germany. This is their only home. So making that decision to leave, and I think this is the same for all of us, it's a highly traumatic thing. Everything you've ever known, everything you've ever loved. I mean, imagine yourself if you were asked to uproot from everything you know, familiar places, where your family had lived for generations, where your grandmother's buried, 2 streets away in the cemetery. You're being asked to leave that and go to a foreign culture with a different language and so on. That's a very difficult decision. So that's one thing to mention. It's a natural human reaction. Now, even if Jews made the decision to leave, on a practical level, leaving Germany itself was by no means actually straightforward. So, to give you an example of this, here are the documents that German Jews needed to leave the country after 1937. Firstly, you need a passport. Next, you need a certificate from the local police noting the formal dissolution of your residence in Germany. You need a certificate from the Reich Ministry of Finance approving emigration. And this itself requires the payment of an emigration tax of 25% on total assets valued at more than 50,000 Reichsmarks. The potential emigrant themselves also had to submit an itemized list of all gifts made to third parties. So in case you're trying to get your money out, conceal your wealth by sending it to relatives abroad or whatever, they're covering that angle as well. Potential emigrants also had to pay a capital transfer tax of 25% of assets in addition to the emigration tax. They also needed certification from the local tax office that there were no outstanding taxes due, along with a form from a currency exchange that all currency regulations had been followed. An emigrant is allowed to take 2,000 Reichsmarks out of the country. It's, again, $400 or so. Any remaining assets would be transferred into blocked bank accounts with restricted access. So after all that, but that's not all. You've still got to do more than that. You also need a customs declaration dated no earlier than 3 days before departure, permitting the export of an itemized list of personal and household goods. This declaration itself requires submission of a list in triplicate of all personal and household goods accompanying the emigrant, stating their value. So you need to have a valuation of everything you've got. Also, those required to facilitate immigration. So what do you the suitcases, the toothbrushes, all those bits and pieces, you've got to put all those down as well. Now, as part of this, you also needed documents attesting to the value of these personal and household goods and written explanations for the necessity of taking them out of the country. So why are you taking this? Why are you taking this clock or whatever it might be? Finally, you had to then get certification from a currency exchange permitting the export of itemized personal and household goods dated no earlier than 14 days before departure. So a huge flurry of activity in the 2 weeks before if you decided to go. And it's only when you've got all these documents now that you're finally allowed, and you've jumped through all these hoops, you're finally allowed now to leave Germany. So it's not only a bureaucratic nightmare, but presents tremendous financial burdens. In general, what this tends to mean is that wealthier people were less inclined to leave. By 1938, emigrants could only take 10% of their net worth with them. After Kristallnacht, and this is why Kristallnacht is so important, Jews who emigrated could only take 10 Reichsmarks per person. So about $2 is all you're allowed to take with you. Everything else now is being kept in the state. In October 1941, it becomes officially forbidden to emigrate from Nazi Germany. The irony of this, of course, is that these policies seem to actually contradict the Nazi government's desire to deport the Jews. But of course, you quickly realize that the Nazi aim was that if the Jews did leave, they were to leave as penniless and destitute refugees. So that's another problem. The emotional problem, the bureaucratic problem, the financial constraints. Maybe the biggest problem of all, though, of course, you need somewhere to go. And a country willing to accept you. This is another part of one of the hoops you've got to jump through. You've got to have a valid visa now, an entrance visa into another country that's willing to accept you. This, of course, is an issue which is wholly in the hands of the international community. And sadly, they will turn their backs on the Jews, condemning them to further impoverishment, further abuse, and of course, in the end, extermination. Now, it seemed at first as if the international community was willing to help. 11 days after Austria had been annexed by Germany, which is March 1938, President Roosevelt proposed an international conference to facilitate an emigration of the Jews from Germany and Austria. In response, Hitler issued the following statement: "I can only hope that the other world, which has such deep sympathy for these criminals," by which he means Jews, "will at least be generous enough to convert this sympathy into practical aid. We on our part are ready to put all these criminals at the disposal of these countries, for all I care, even on luxury ships." So what Roosevelt does, he convenes an international conference of 32 nations in the French resort town of Evian on the shores of Lake Geneva. And Roosevelt himself is receiving pressure back home from constituents who are seeing this, of course, on the news, seeing Kristallnacht as well, the horrible images of Kristallnacht. And they want him to do something about the refugee problem. But on a personal level, his involvement in Evian was less than enthusiastic. The US delegation itself was headed not by the Secretary of State or even by the Undersecretary, but instead by Myron C. Taylor, who was a businessman and a close friend of FDR. Of course, in the interwar period, the United States is wedded to a policy of isolationism. They refused to join the League of Nations. Many people at this time regret participation in the First World War, that it was costly, it was divisive. And of course, the government itself in 1924 introduced its own severe immigration quotas, designed to stem the flow of European migrants, who many felt had led to the introduction of dangerous and divisive ideologies such as socialism and anarchism into American life. So, in truth, the Evian Conference was designed to protect America's image, not to help Jewish refugees. As the conference proceeded, you get delegate after delegate excusing their country from accepting more refugees. So, standing up, we'd love to take more refugees, but... So lots of talk of sympathy, but very little real practical help. Many Jews, of course, had hoped that the British would allow them to go to Palestine. But due to Arab opposition, the British introduced a white paper in May 1939, which places severe restrictions on Jewish immigration. It provides for only 10,000 Jewish immigrants per year for 5 years. So that closes yet another avenue of escape for the refugees from Nazi Germany. So the Evian Conference is a crucial turning point in the history of the Holocaust. The world's democracies made it clear that they were willing to do next to nothing for the Jews of Europe. And of course the German government, and Hitler of course, is now able to state with great pleasure how astounding it was that all these foreign countries criticised Germany for their treatment of Jews, but none of them themselves wanted to open their doors when the opportunity was offered. And there's a deep truth in this, of course. Anti-Semitism is rife across the West, across the world. And many shared a similar impulse of mistrust or hatred against the Jews that the Nazis would pursue with such vicious genocidal mania. So with the international community closing its doors, it's actually left to private individuals and charitable organisations to try and fill the void. And just remarkable people who take their time, spend their money to go and help in their own small way to get as many refugees out as possible. I mean, one of the most remarkable efforts, of course, is the Kindertransports. And this is the Kindertransport is really the informal name which is given to this rescue effort, which brings thousands of refugee children, mainly Jewish, to Britain from Nazi-controlled Europe. And it goes on from December 1938 right up to, right to 1940. And it's private citizens, it's organisations. And what they have to do is guarantee to pay for each child's care, their education, and their eventual emigration out of Britain. Parents or guardians couldn't accompany their children, and children themselves could only bring 10 Reichsmarks, 1 suitcase and 1 handbag with them. Upon arrival, these children were sheltered in temporary facilities. One of the great problems is, despite the altruism of the people who are actually organising this effort, is they have to find foster families, and that's not always easy. Often the foster families they do find are insensitive to cultural or religious differences, and for some of these children, their heritage was all but erased. A few of the younger children were given new names, for example. Some of them even given a new religion. And of course, maintaining contact between parent and child, and the parents back home, remember, is often incredibly difficult as the war progresses. The first transport is December the 2nd, 1938 from Berlin. The last one, May 14th, 1940, which is the day the Dutch surrendered to Germany. Now, most of these children did survive the war. I suppose that's one thing. And a very small, tiny percentage of them ended up being reunited with their parents. The majority, though, never saw their families again. And most of their families, of course, would die in Nazi extermination camps. In total, the Kindertransports save around 10,000 children. During the Holocaust, though, the Nazis and their collaborators killed nearly 1.5 million children. So you have to think about this proportionally. A similar, if doomed, effort to save Jewish children from Germany was attempted in the United States in February 1939. Following the horrific events of Kristallnacht, which, as I've said, were all over the American press, the Wagner-Rogers bill was introduced in the US Congress, and this was to permit one-time entry of 20,000 children under the age of 14 above the quota limit that had been set for German immigrants. And the bill stipulated that financial support for these children would be provided by private sources, many of them Jewish organizations in the United States, so that no expenditure of public funds would be needed. And within days, over 5,000 Americans offered to house these children when they arrived. So again, so lots of promises that this will not burden the state, and so please allow this through. So it's a very modest bill in many ways. However, the American Legion then stepped in and publicly opposed the bill on moral grounds, arguing, I still can't believe when I read this, that it was wrong to separate parents from children. One North Dakota senator stood up and said that charity should begin at home, so we shouldn't be helping these refugees. And the debates go on and on. They go on and on for about 5 months. And finally, the Wagner-Rogers bill dies in committee. And the tragedy is, of course, the majority of these 20,000 children would be killed in the Holocaust. Perhaps this whole issue of Jewish emigration from Germany is symbolized best, or worst, by the tragic story of the German ocean liner, the SS St. Louis. And this sort of epitomizes really the desperate and futile struggle of Jews who are trying to escape Germany. 13th of May 1939, the Nazis allowed 937 Jews to set sail for Cuba, a country which it was believed had a more liberal immigration policy. And these hopeful passengers carried what they believed were valid permits, guaranteeing them temporary stay until visas and permanent refuge could be secured. Shockingly, what happens is they do get all the way to Havana, and when they arrive in Havana, only 29 of them are allowed to disembark. The rest of them are all refused entry by Cuban immigration. The ship itself, when the ship's ordered to leave then, so they want rid of this ship now after taking just these 29 people, several passengers attempt suicide. Cuban police boats then shadow the St. Louis in case some passengers try to jump ship as it's going out and swim to shore. So this ship now is lost. It's on its own now in international waters and needs to find safe haven. So it sets sail for the US. As the ship nears the US and its territorial waters off Florida, the Coast Guard fire warning shots and deny entry into American waters. And what you have is this tragic situation of this ship for 3 days cruising slowly off the US coast, waiting in vain for America to accept its human cargo. The US government, though, refused to open its doors. And in mid-June, after 35 days of aimless sailing, the St. Louis is forced to return to Europe, where eventually Britain, France, Holland and Belgium finally agreed to divide the 900 or so passengers between them. Now, of course, with the German occupation of Europe, Western Europe, most of these former passengers once again would fall under Nazi rule. For many years, it was assumed that most of these passengers perished amongst the millions of other Holocaust victims. Recent research, though, does show that at least 460 passengers eventually did arrive in the United States. The captain of this ship, a remarkable one, a German captain, Gustav Schröder, himself actually survived the war. And for his efforts to find safe haven for his passengers, Captain Schröder was honoured posthumously by Yad Vashem as one of the righteous amongst the nations. So ultimately, the answer to our question is that while against all odds, many German Jews did bravely manage to escape Nazi Germany, the reason that many didn't was that no one else wanted them. An attitude to refugees still so sadly prevalent in our own world today. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all next time. Take care.